Hello and welcome to Booklust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is Jayne Ann Krentz, whose new book, All Night Long, has just been published. Jayne, thank you so much for coming in today.
Oh, my pleasure.
I thought today we could talk about your new book, which is one of your romantic suspense novels, and then maybe talk about your whole career as a writer of a particular genre of fiction and how that all fits into the whole literary world.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this new book, as I said, is romantic suspense, and you write that under your own name, Jayne Ann Krentz, but you do some of your other books under different names. Could you talk about what in your mind,
why authors use different
names? Yes.
Well, one of the things about surviving as long as I have in popular fiction is you do wind up with a bucket of names at the end of the career. And it seems to be just true of writing in popular fiction. Lots of different reasons at the beginning, often contractual. But nowadays, I use three names to distinguish the three eras in which I write. I write contemporary romantic suspense as Jayne Ann Krentz. I write historical romantic suspense as Amanda Quick. And I write what is called futuristic, kind of quasi-science fiction, paranormal type romantic suspense as Jane Castle. But my voice is my voice. And if you like me under one name, you're probably going to like me under the other. If you don't like me under one name, you probably won't like the others. I tend to use a balance of suspense and romance. I call it romantic suspense. As far as I'm concerned, it is its own genre. It's not pure romance. It's not pure hardcore suspense. But I think it is its own thing, and I think it's always been a very popular kind of story for women.
So some of your writing predecessors in the area of romantic suspense, when I thought about that, I thought about Dorothy Eden and Mary Stuart. Would you?
Yes, I'd go back even farther. Nancy Drew.
Right.
Grew up on Nancy Drew. It left an indelible impression upon me. What can I say?
But her romance with Ned didn't go very far.
Well,
not as far as some of.
That's true.
As we would write in contemporary, even contemporary young adult.
That's true. But
books.
I look to my roots, and those
and
those are my roots. Actually, combined with the early Robert Heinlein and Andre Norton. And at the same time, somehow I came out with a conglomeration of those three or four writers. Later, Dick Francis. I've always loved popular fiction. I think it is more important than people give it credit for.
So let's talk about, how do you define popular fiction?
Popular fiction, I think, are stories that are built on the old heroic tradition of storytelling. They are stories in which, yes, definitely flawed characters, but flawed characters who overcome their flaws long enough to do the right thing. They set examples. They are heroes in the old-fashioned sense of the word. The stories convey a moral, and they talk a lot about things that are not talked about much in modern culture. They talk about and hold dear things like honor and courage and the healing power of love. And we go to popular fiction to affirm those old values and virtues, I think.
And do you think that that's the draw? Is that
definitely
that kind of?
Yes. Where else are you going to get it?
Mm-hmm.
And those core values, courage, honor, conviction, determination, those things that we associate with the heroic values, are absolutely crucial to civilization. We can't survive without them, and we need them. And right now, in 21st century America, I think popular fiction is the repository for those virtues and values, and that's why we're drawn back to them time and again. It isn't the happy ending. People mistake that. Romances in general tend to have a happy ending because that is part of the value of that particular kind of genre. But it is no more, it is as necessary in the romance as seeing justice done is in the mystery. If the mystery is not solved, if justice is not done, you may have a very good book, a very interesting book, but you won't have a good mystery. Mm-hmm. And that is why with the romance, the relationship will be resolved in a satisfactory manner to make it a romance.
Mm-hmm. When you first began writing, what was the first, which was the first name that you used? I have to say that you're a librarian, and one of your first jobs was at Duke University, right at the library there. So what made you take this detour away from.
How did I get into popular
How
fiction?
did you get into popular fiction?
I think most of the writers I know, and it seems to be true across the board regardless of the genre of the people I've talked to, most writers get into writing popular fiction after being lifelong readers of popular fiction. And for those who become writers, I think it's a matter of they finally want to tell the story their way. It's not the old story, well, oh, I was reading that book and it was so bad I threw it across the room and I said I could do better than this. That doesn't happen very often. Certainly didn't happen to me. But there does come a time when you want to tell the story your way. And if that compulsion is strong enough, you end up writing. If it isn't, you go another path. You become a librarian.
Or you stay a librarian.
Or you stay a librarian, yeah.
Right. I mean, I always thought in a way that it was because you wrote the books that you wanted to read. And there just somehow are never enough of those books around, so you might as well write them and do more. So did you begin doing romantic suspense? Was that your earliest?
From the start. It's always been part of my voice, the balance between the suspense and the romance. And I think it's because in romantic suspense, you've got two of the most fundamental dynamics of human nature going on. You've got the power of a relationship, and you've got the power of danger. Mm-hmm. And in writing, those create enormous conflicts. So you combine the two, and you've got lots to work with. The trick to writing romantic suspense is that the suspense should always take a twist based on what happens in the relationship, and the relationship should always take another turn based on what happens in the suspense. So the two feed off each other, and that's what powers that kind of novel.
So is what comes to you first when you think about doing a new book, do you come up with a plot first, or is there a sort of a normal progression for you? A good idea for a story, or the characters? I mean, I loved the character of Luke in your new book, All Night Long. I thought he was just a wonderful romantic suspense hero. I mean, I thought he just was very appealing and had secrets of his own, and so that the relationship between him and Irene, who also had secrets and pain in her past, I thought that made a very nice pair.
They were the two people on the face of the earth who could understand what each other had been through, right?
Yes.
Well, you hit upon it. I think the trick to good storytelling is the revelation of secrets all the way through the story. And I think that's what keeps the reader going, keeps the reader wanting to turn the pages. Mm-hmm. And in this case, you had two people who had been through two very traumatic experiences. Luke is a former, never ex-Marine. They're always former Marines.
Once a Marine, always a Marine.
And Irene had lost her parents in a terrible, tragic murder-suicide scenario, or so everybody thinks. And both of these two people survived. In a way, I think the theme of the novel actually became that to survive the kind of trauma that Luke had seen as a Marine in war, and that the heroine had seen in the past, is to arrive at and accept a new definition of normal. And people who have been through this kind of thing and struggle always to get back to a fantasy of what normal should be will drive themselves mad. Mm-hmm. And the ones who survive are the ones who can learn to accept the new reality. And I think if there is a message or a theme in the book, that would be it.
Mm-hmm. So do you start with that? How did you start what was the impetus for this particular book? I mean, it surely can't be that, oh my gosh, my contract with Putnam says I have a book due, I better sit down and work on it.
Most basic writing reason of all, I have to pay the rent. Now this story I knew going in was going to be probably the darkest one I had ever written, because I was going to be dealing with things like post-traumatic stress syndrome, and mm-hmm. Those are dark issues. Mm-hmm. So I knew that going in, but I also needed characters who could handle them, could deal with them, and also there was a murder to be solved. Two people who have been that scarred have a lot to learn in terms of being able to love again. That's a difficult step to make after you have had to protect yourself mm-hmm. from such trauma. So a lot of the story is the two characters overcoming their own issues enough to be able to trust the other person with their hearts, and also solve a murder as this thing goes on. But the storyline, I think, is not atypical of what it's still me. It's still the kind of book I always write. Mm-hmm. The issues and themes are a little darker, but these are my kind of characters. And the truth is, all of my characters are imbued at the core with my values and pretty much my worldviews. And I think that's where they get their heart. It also, in a sense, limits them. These are the only kinds of characters I'm really interested in doing. I'm not interested in doing characters who, as heroes at any rate, or heroines, who have values radically different from my own. So I'm never going to write that book. I could write it, I suppose, but I would not be my heart would not be in that story. So if you come back to my books, it's because I think something in you resonates with the values and worldviews embedded in my characters. If those values and worldviews conflict with your own, you're not going to like my books. And I think that's why we go back to authors again and again, or we don't go back to authors again and again.
How much research do you do then when you do a historical romantic suspense?
I do a fair amount. That's the librarian in me. Part of it is I just don't want to be embarrassed in print. I know other librarians are out there reading this. And I also have a degree in history, so I'm conscious of not screwing up too much in that. And embarrassing myself with that crowd either. And just not embarrassing yourself with the crowd of very well-read historical novel readers. They know, they've read a lot. They'll know if you use the wrong, if you put something in even the clothes are wrong, they're going to catch you on it. So I do a fair amount. I also research the particular topic that's going to be the theme of the story. The next my Amanda Quick title coming out, which is set in Victorian England, involves the early days of photography. So I did a lot of research on the early days of photography, which turned out to be quite fascinating. I had no idea it was such a dangerous profession in the beginning.
Oh, how? Why was it dangerous?
Well, part of it was just the chemicals they were using. Cyanide was in every amateur photographer's darkroom. Always they were poisoning the family dog, or the maid who had a bad love affair would race into the dark room and down the cyanide. It was used as a fixer. Explosions were common. They used ether. Well, ether is a very explosive substance. And Victorian photographers were very fond of smoking in the dark room. It was funny because the magazines at the time were always railing against the lack of safeguards. Take these precautions. Be careful. Don't use this. Don't smoke in the dark room. This kind of thing. And they just did it by the hundreds and thousands. They loved it.
Well, so does your hero in this new book smoke?
No.
Because
my
yes, right. I was going to say.
Yeah, a lot of my characters do not do what actually would have been quite acceptable behavior. The use of certain drugs that we no longer accept. The use of smoking, and it was very common in Victorian England.
Because I was thinking of a very debonair.
Yes, definitely.
Victorian gentleman in his dark room.
Yeah. I don't give them the smoking habit. Luckily for me, in addition to the smoking side of things, there was also a strong strain of the health consciousness in Victorian London. There were those who were very much into physical fitness, the bathhouses, where they took steam baths and things like that. So they did have a consciousness of health too. So I kind of lean on that side. Yeah.
And so with that, did you start by saying, where do your ideas come from?
Where do the ideas come from? Every time I'm asked that question, I struggle to answer. I don't think any writer really knows. I think they're either there or they're not. Reading, writing, the act of creating actually generates more ideas. I will start out with a rough outline, very rough outline, usually based more on the mechanics of the plot. Like with photography, there's certain kinds of scenes you're going to want to use just to illustrate that world. And a lot of how the bad guy is going to die, will come out of that world. Those kinds of mechanical things are loosely spread out before me when I sit down to write. But the really good ideas I won't get until I'm halfway through the book, or even 3/4, or almost. I've had some of my best ideas come to me as I write the last word of the first draft. And then I go back and I go through and embed those new ideas in. And I end up doing several drafts because of that, because that's the process I work with. I know other people who create elaborate outlines, scene-by-scene outlines that will take them all the way through the novel. I don't know where I'm going when I get up in the morning, is the sad truth. And I think if I did, I think I'd lose interest. I think part of what keeps me energized and excited about my own writing is the uncertainty of where I'm going to go that day.
And you always do hear about writers. I mean, I've heard writers say, "Oh, I sort of sat down at the not typewriter anymore, the computer, and the characters told me what they wanted to do." And you're not saying exactly that, but in some ways that is what you mean. That the impetus of the plot, the story takes you in places that you would not have thought that you would necessarily go.
As I said, I think the act of creating generates creativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So do you write in an office? I mean, do you put up on like a bulletin board the outline of the plot outline? And
no, I'd start out with an outline, but after the first day I throw it away. And I do write in an office, yes. Now, I do know some people who write with a storyboard kind of approach, but I've never been able to make that work for me. It's just, all I can say is it's organized chaos. I don't know how else to explain it. I wish I had a better handle on this. I could write more if I understood how I did it.
Well, you could get, like Anthony Trollope would write for, I don't know, 2 hours before he went to work at the post office in the morning and do that. So do you set yourself a certain amount of time that you're going to write, or a certain number of words? And then following on that question, do you then do any rewriting as you're doing your first draft, or do you just?
Yes to all of it. I do set myself, I am a fairly disciplined writer. I'm at the computer at 7 in the morning, I work till noon. That's my high energy time of the day, and if there's any creativity in me that day, that's when it's going to come out. And I do shoot for a certain number of words. I don't always make it. Sometimes I get flying and I go over, and I'll write until 3 o'clock in the afternoon if I get a wind in my sail of work. But other than that, I do try to stay on a certain writing schedule in terms of word count, thinking that no matter how bad it is, I can always go back and fix it. Better to have something down than nothing. And you do go back like the next day and look over what you've written the day before and make changes? Oh, yes. Yeah. The editing process is more chaos because it's always ongoing. Having said that, I will also, when I finally do get to the end of a first draft, there will be at least 3 or 4 more times through from start to finish. But before I get to that end of that first draft, there's been a lot of back and forthing going on all the way along the line.
And do you have a first reader who always goes over, reads your manuscript?
I have friends that I've known for years and who know my work, and I will often send them a copy of the manuscript. Not that they would get serious about the editing or anything, but I think they would tell me if it just didn't ring true or something along those lines. But my first real reader, and the reader I pay most attention to, is my editor. And I'm very fortunately working with a wonderful editor now, Leslie Gelbman, who gets my stuff. Nothing greater for an author than having an editor who likes your work and gets it. And she is one of those wonderful editors in popular fiction who takes a global approach to the story. She knows what you can do, what you should be doing to express your voice, and she will be able to point out where I've dropped the ball or overdone something. If I make if I have a consistent error that I make in my writing, it's probably beating the reader over the head a little too much with the same information. And part of that is because he's or she is reading it in a one-day stretch of time. I'm writing it out over a period of months. And sometimes I think, I better tell them again. So there are certain things that I'll tend to do over and over again. So try to catch myself, but not always. But anyhow, Leslie has been a fabulous editor for me.
Is there one of your names that you really enjoy most writing, or?
What I have found is that when I come out of one name, I am refreshed to go into another name. I'm looking for the new world. I want that other world when I come out of one world. So cycling through the 3 names has been very invigorating, very refreshing for me as a writer. It's kept me going with a lot of energy and excitement. One of the things about switching between the 3 worlds, the historical and the futuristic and the contemporary, is that there are stories you can do in one that you simply can't do in the other. Plots you can do in one that you can't do in the other. You can set up kinds of romantic conflicts, say in the historical setting, that just wouldn't fly in a contemporary setting. And when it comes to the futuristics, you get to write all your own rules, which is a lot of fun. So between those 3 settings, I have always kept a lot of personal excitement going in my own writing, and so I treasure all three of them.
Did you ever want to do, or did you ever do just straight romance without the suspense?
No, you know, from day one, every book I've ever plotted has had a suspense element. Now, in the older days when I was writing category romance for Harlequin Silhouette, the romance was a much stronger element in the story, and the suspense was less of an element. But it was always there. I think it's always been part of my voice. Like I said, it came out of Nancy Drew.
Yeah, right. That's Nancy Drew she did in many ways have this enormous influence on women's sense of self in a way. Did you, when you were writing those category romances for Silhouette and Harlequin, one of the things that people always hear is that those are always written to a very rigorous outline. Page 6, they kiss. Page 14, things move on to a hot and heavier, maybe it's page 54, they move on to a more intense relationship. Is that, and so romances in many ways were always looked down on because they were so formulaic.
There is certainly a length restriction in that, although there is now in popular fiction almost throughout, just because of the finances of publishing. Publishing a 1,000-page book these days is no longer a profitable enterprise in most cases. So there is a page restriction. The different lines had conventions. Some were definitely spicier than others. And if you were going to write for the spicier lines, you needed to know that. I mean, you needed to read it going in and understand the level of sensuality that the readers were expecting. In the same way if you were writing for one of the sweeter lines. Aside from those issues, looking back on it, no editor I ever had gave me a list of rules, and no editor I ever had said you can't do that. One of the great things about writing for romance, and this is very true especially in the category lines, is that the publisher's bottom line does not stand or fall with any one book. Therefore, they're willing to allow experiments that are unheard of in mainstream publishing simply because too much money would be lost if the experiment goes bad. It is a cradle, I think, and a nurturing place for all kinds of storytelling that would not be given a shot elsewhere. And the proof of that is that so many of the popular suspense writers today, for example, Iris Johansen, Sandra Bown, Janet Ivanovich, long list, they all came out of romance.
Jennifer Cruzy.
Jennifer Cruzy. They all learned their craft there, and they all took their experiments there, learned what they wanted to do, and made it fly in romance, and then after that it bubbled right out into mainstream fiction. The popular trend toward the paranormal today, which is very strong in women's fiction, came out of romance. These are the experiments that worked, in essence. A lot of what we would call standard mainstream women's fiction goes on in romance. Again, kind of under the critical radar. And I think that's a good thing, by and large, because it does mean that the publishers are willing to allow various kinds of experiments. So no, I always found it a very free place to write.
Romances have always been, whether they're romantic suspense novels or pure category romances, have in many ways been looked down on, continue to be looked down on by the taste makers. And it wasn't until recently that libraries, for example, bought paperback romances, which is how they generally appeared just in paperback. And bookstores, many bookstores don't have romance sections. So what's the disconnect? I mean, why?
Well, the easy answer is to say that it's always been fiction written for women by women.
Yeah.
And historically, that's always had a tough sell into the mainstream. Women loved it, but it's for 200 years, there have been plenty of, going on 300 now, always been plenty of critics for fiction that was written that spoke to women's issues in a positive, affirming way, I think would be the answer. Romances are definitely more sentimental than is currently acceptable in most literary fiction. They do not cling to the tenets of modern psychological theory. They are more dependent on the heroic and the conventions of the heroic storytelling mode, which are also not highly esteemed
these
popular
days.
in literary fiction these days. They tend to end happily, which is a real big no-no if you're trying to make it in literary fiction. And I think those are the big factors that set them outside the acceptable sphere of what was considered good fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But that never hurt the audiences loving them,
Right.
I have to say.
Right.
And I take the Darwinian approach, which is it doesn't survive if it isn't serving some fundamental survival value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what romance and popular fiction in general does, as I said earlier, is encapsulate our really old core values and convey them to us and to the next generation.
Very briefly, do you hear from male readers?
Yes, I do actually. Yes. The books are picking up a male readership. I'm sure it will never be the dominant side of my readership.
Right, and it shouldn't be probably. I mean,
no, I'm not really writing in that sense
Right.
for men, but I am amazed at the number of men. And if I ask them when they come through a line and I'll say, why do you read the books? And they say, I just like a good story. That's my favorite answer. I just like a good story.
Yeah, that must give you a good feeling.
It does.
Because that's because you're a storyteller first and foremost. Thank you so much, Jayne Ann Krentz, and good luck with your new book and continued sales of all of your other ones too.
Thank you very much.